When he gazed upon his creation surrounding him, he said to his host of demons, the ones who had come forth out of him, I am a jealous God, and there is no God but me. But by doing this, he admitted to his demons that there is indeed another God. For if there were no other God, whom would he possibly be jealous of? Hello, this is the Succubus Scholar, and today we shall be covering the mighty counterpart of Lilith, Samael. The poison of God, if translated as Samael, or the blind god, Sumael, depending on where you read. Samael is every bit as confusing and frustrating to research as Lilith is, particularly in regards to his origins. What you will notice, however, listener, is that although, like his chief consort Lilith, he is often depicted as evil, he is not outrightly so, and even behaves as the adversary because that is his role. From a beautiful but wrathful angel with 12 wings, to a hideous snake-like monster with a lion's head, Samael has been conveyed over the centuries, hopping forth between the divine and damned, a being of both worlds and not fully belonging to either. So, without further ado, let us get into it. The secret of secrets. Out of the scorching noon of Isaac, out of the dregs of wine, a fungus emerged, a cluster. Male and female together, red as a rose, expanding in many directions and paths. The male is called Samael. His female is always included within him. Just as it is on the side of holiness, so it is on the other side, male and female embracing one another. The female of Samael is called Serpent, woman of whoredom and of all flesh, end of days. Two evil spirits joined together. The spirit of the male is subtle. The spirit of the female is diffused in many waves and paths, but joined to the spirit of the male. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Perhaps one of the best known quotes from the Bible. Even those who do not study such texts are familiar with the sentence and can point to Genesis as its origin. But so few people understand the depths of its meaning in the Kabbalistic sense. For it was not sunlight that woke into being. It was the start of the emanation, the flowing down from En Sof of the divine light from the Godhead itself. The divine light emanated down to form the worlds in a corresponding chain, each sephira being filled and brought into existence by the grace of the divine source. In turn, making up the four worlds, forming up the tree of life that many have seen as the diagram of the various sephiras. Down it flowed until it reached Malkut or Asaya, the world of action. But during this incredible creation process, something went awry. Further up the chain, that is. The sphere of Gevura, the sephira of judgment, a force of righteous fury that would enact holy punishments of the Almighty. However, like in many processes, this sphere was chaotic in its fury and needed to be tempered lest it destroy all of creation. Like tainted ore, it was purified, the dross being discarded, or, like the dregs of wine, tipped away at the bottom of the barrel. In the Zohar 2, 242b to 244b, it is described as the smoke emerging from the newly formed sphere, one of shadow, another of death, joining together to form the shadow of death. Tishbe, in his Wisdom of the Zohar, would identify these two as terms used to depict Samael and Lilith. These dregs, or forsaken worlds, would separate from the sephira and even act much like a protective shell towards it. Many view the Clipper as a reverse of the Sephirothic tree. However, few realise that, originally, it was more like four spheres, one inside the other, hiding the divine light at its centre, with each one representing a different form of anger, be it jealousy, rage, and so forth. This is the flashing fire. All these are the kernel's shells, surrounding it, one within the other, one within the other. It is the fire that clasps the brightness within it, as it is written, and brightness around it, and this is the innermost of all, and touches the kernel. So it is that Samael and Lilith would rule over these worlds and its occupants, still filled with the fury of the sphere that they are the byproduct of. However, this does not mean they have no place in creation. For when the people sin against the Lord, so their power grows, and they unleash their ills upon the material world as punishment for our transgressions. Rather than acting as adversaries of heaven, they instead work as part of the greater will. This is given as an explanation of the ancient tradition of sacrificing a goat to Azazel or Samael during Yom Kippur. By doing so, the ancient Israelites recognised that despite their evil nature, the Shadim and their ruler Samael worked as part of the divine plan, and as such they must be given their due. For to spurn them completely would be to spurn the part of the divine will and wreak havoc upon themselves. Those of you who have seen my other videos will already be familiar with the treatise of the left emanation by the Cohen brothers. Here we are presented as Samael and Lilith being formed as shadow counterparts of Adam and Eve. Both had their place beneath the throne of glory, but Lilith brought about a catastrophe that weakened this balance. The nature of this catastrophe is never explained, but my belief is that the sentence, ever since then the snakes have increased and taken on the form of biting snakes. This suggests to me that Lilith sought to ensure that her children multiplied and grew dominant over the celestial children, these being either the angels or offspring of Adam and Eve. Intriguingly, she does this with the aid of Gamaliel, also the name of the clipper she rules over, and Nahashiel, perhaps deriving similar etymology to the Hebrew word Nehashim, meaning snake, but also often used when referring to witches and sorcerers who gained their powers through these creatures. Indeed, it is in this treaty we are given mention of the blind dragon, the mysterious entity who acts as an intermediary between Lilith and Samael so they can engage in sexual union. This dragon is identified as Tanaver, or Leviathan, from whom the trio would have already overrun this world had the Holy One not intervened. As I have before, I highly recommend reading this treaty. If there's one origin text I implore you study if you have any interest in Sitra Ara, then I recommend this one, as it gives some of the earliest accounts of Lilith and Samael, along with the structure of these demons and the conflicts between them, as well as revealing the powers of prophecy and invisibility that they can grant. Samael is often identified as Satan in Midrashic texts, his role as adversary or accuser towards humanity identified via this title. But again, this merely denotes his position in the divine plan, rather than as an adversary of God himself. Until, that is, we come to the Gnostics, who equate him to the demiurge, that is. This dim ruler has 3 names. Yaldabaoth is the first, Saklas is the second, Samael is the third. Believed to originate from the Greek demiurgos, meaning artisan, the demiurge is the term given to the one who created the material world as we know it. The role of the demiurge would evolve in Platonic studies as an intermediary of the supreme being to the material world, but ultimately as a good entity that seeks to perfect all things as much as possible. It is the Gnostics who would claim that the demiurge is none other than Yahweh, the Christian God of the Old Testament, and is in fact antagonistic and false, blinding the masses to the existence of the true God. The Apocryphon of John tells this belief best, stating that the monad, the supreme being, first created Barbelo, and through her brought forth the entities known as aeons, beings of the divine light. However, one of these aeons, Sophia, sought to bring about her own image without consent from the greater will, and as a result, she became horrified when she brought forth a twisted creature in the shape of a serpent with a lion's head. Ashamed at what she had done, she concealed him within a cloud and gave him a throne there, bestowing upon him the name Yaldabaoth. They go on to say that the demiurge imagined that he created all these things of himself, while he in reality made them in conjunction with the productive power of Achamoth. He formed the heavens, yet was ignorant of the heavens. He fashioned man, yet knew not man. He brought to light the earth, yet had no acquaintance with the earth. And in like manner they declare that he was ignorant of the forms of all that he made, and knew not even of the existence of his own mother, but imagined that he himself was all things. They further affirm that his mother originated this opinion in his mind because she desired to bring him forth possessed of such a character, that he should be the head and source of his own essence, and the absolute ruler of every kind of operation. That was afterwards attempted. This mother they also call Ogdoad, Sophia, Terra, Jerusalem, Holy Spirit, and, with a masculine reference, Lord. As highlighted by Irenaeus' work in reference to the teachings of Valentius, who identified the demiurge as a god of the Old Testament, the demiurge is not so much evil, but misguided, as a result of his abandonment by his mother. Ignorant of his origins, he would begin fashioning servants, entities that we would refer to as the seraphim or angels today. By the nature of his birth, he had an instinctual understanding of the patterns of the firmament above, and began modelling his creations around it. Of his 7 initial servants, known as the Archons, he bestowed upon them their own realm to rule over. All the while Sophia saw the warped things her creation had brought forth, and began to hide away from the other Aeons in shame and guilt for what she had done. Her light significantly diminished. Those of you who have seen my earlier videos, particularly my devotion and invocation of Lilith, as from Donald Tyson's Liebe Lilith, a method I found incredibly powerful in establishing communication with her, will likely recognise some of these names mentioned here as used in the invocation. That is because Tyson's work is heavily influenced by this. The work plays out very similar to the Apocryphon of John, save it is Barbelo rather than Sophia who created the demiurge, and that Lilith is included here as one of the demiurge's archons. In his longing for his mother, Sophia, the demiurge brought forth Lilith, an imperfect and ever-lustful reflection of the divine Sophia. In another link between Lilith and the mother-son Oedipus complex, the two mate to bring forth the creations mentioned earlier, in a mockery of how the monad and Barbelo had brought forth other aeons. Turning in upon himself, he sought his reflection in the fiery furnace of his heart, and twisted it as a potter twists his clay into a semblance of the shining form of Babylon. He fashioned a consort like to his mother in all her lineaments that issued forth from his left side. Her name is Lilith, she who walks in beauty clothed with the shadows of the moon. Both the modern Liber Lilith and the Apocryphon of John go on to state that the other aeons would come to discover the existence of Samael, or Yasbalf, rejuvenating Sophia from her diminished state and accepting her repentance. They then sought to deal with the blasphemies that Samael was creating. First they gave him a vision, thinking to create the image of his own likeness. He and his fellow demons created Adam. The moment they did so, the greater will took the light of Sophia within Samael and transferred it to Adam. When life came to Adam, the demons became envious, and Samael realised he had been deceived, for Adam was clearly superior in form and mind to him. Aghast, they cast Adam down into the lowest material realm and imprisoned him within Eden. From there I could go on, listener, but while Samael may well be the demiurge, there is so much in regard to this side of him that this video will become far too long. I include it here to be a possible origin of both Samael and Lilith. If you want a separate video on the demiurge, do let me know. It follows that in the scheme of the powers of evil described by the Zohar, the female is viewed as stronger than the male. Jacob described that in his dreams he found it relatively easy to battle the male forces, i.e. Samael, whereas he found it much more exhausting to battle the female forces, i.e. Lilith. Even when he finally won a victory against those forces, such a victory was not absolute, and his dominance could not be compared to his dominance over the parallel male forces of Satan. I began part 1 with the Zohar Citrate Torah 1147b to 148b, not only because it provides an account of Samael's creation, but also it denotes his ways are subtle, whilst Lilith's ways are many. Indeed, in Hakeem's commentary on Genesis, Jacob would account that battling the forces of Lilith was far more exhausting than those of Samael. But we should not take this to mean that Samael and his male kin are idle or weak. Indeed, in many Jewish texts there are accounts of Samael's involvement throughout the Bible, in particular with the sons of the patriarch Abraham and even Abraham himself. When Abraham made ready to sacrifice Isaac, in the Bereshit V'Bar 56:4, Samael comes and tries to persuade them from it, decrying how mad he is for murdering his own son. Whilst this may seem like Samael taking the more high ground, listener, as we continue you will see it is more likely that he was trying to prove the weakness of their faith in God. Where Lilith seems to act against man to promote those of her own brood, Samael very much acts like the celestial angel as a role of savage punisher of the faithless, much like the savage inquisition of the witch trials, always seeking the guilty and keen to prove the worthlessness of man. Indeed, it is stated as much in the Midrashic text Shemot Rabbah 18. Rabbi Yosef said, "To what are Michael and Samael similar? To a defender and a prosecutor standing in court. This one is speaking and that one is speaking. When this one is finished his words and that one his words, that defender knows that he has won. Then he begins to praise the judge that issues a verdict. That prosecutor then requests to add something. The defender then says to him, 'Be quiet and let us hear from the judge.' So it is that Michael and Samael stand in front of the divine presence, and Satan, Samael, prosecutes and Michael deliberates on the merit of Israel. And then the Satan comes to speak, and Michael silences him." There are texts such as this equating Samael as none other than Satan. Satan or adversary being one of his titles. But rather than as adversary of God, it is more as a prosecutor against mankind. But perhaps this chip on his shoulder for humanity does not stem purely from his duty, and does take a leaf akin to the tales of the demiurge, in that he is jealous of us and seeks to prove himself superior, supporting his first consort in promoting their own over those of Adam and Eve's. Radak's commentary on Genesis gives an account of how the angels, upon seeing how quickly Adam was growing in wisdom, feared they would lose their place to him at God's side. Samael, most powerful of the angels, took his host to the material plane to seek to upend this, and found that the serpent was the most sympathetic to his cause. Samael would ride upon this serpent that looked like a camel. Remember, it is said the serpent had legs, but lost them as punishment for tempting Eve. And together they would seek to bring the downfall of man by tempting Eve with the fruit. Samael was the great prince in heaven. The Chaffoth had 4 wings, and the seraphim had 6 wings, and Samael had 12 wings. What did Samael do? He took his band, and descended, and saw all the creatures which the Holy One, blessed be he, had created in his world. And he found among them none so skilled to do evil as the serpent. As it is said, now the serpent was more subtle than any beast on the field. Its appearance was something like that of the camel, and he mounted and rode upon it. The Torah began to cry aloud, saying, "Why, O Samael, now that the world is created, is it the time to rebel against the omnipresent? Is it like a time when thou shouldst lift up thyself on high?" Samael would ultimately be successful in his plot, but his manipulations would become known to God, and his punishment would be swift. Naphtali Setzravatson claimed he received 50 lashes before being cast out of heaven and chief no longer, replaced by Michael. Indeed, in the Rabbeinu Baya commentary, Vayikra 1677, it is said, as Samael fell, he gripped the wings of Michael and tried to pull him down with him, but was saved by God's intervention. And the serpent would have its feet removed and made to suffer the shedding of its skin every 7 years. But this would not prevent Samael from approaching Adam or Eve once again. Instead, he would come to Eve and bear 2 sons from her, Abel and Cain, which, as most of you would know, would end in disaster. Cain murdering Abel and being cast out, and Adam forsaking Eve in his grief, during which Lilith and Naamah would come and beget demons from him. But let us move forwards now, back to the times of Abraham. The binding of Isaac would still go through, despite Samael's efforts to dissuade him and his son, but Abraham's line would continue to be plagued by Samael's ministrations. Isaac would have 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Over Jacob would be appointed Michael, and over Esau as guardian angel would be appointed none other than Samael. What I find interesting about this is Samael is said to rule over the Se'irim, hairy beings akin to satyrs, and Esau was also described to be hairy, whilst Jacob was not. Perhaps Esau was of the other side in some way. Certainly, Samael would go out of his way to try and allow for Esau to surpass his brother. In Ginsberg's Legend of the Jews, he would start early by attempting to slay Jacob in his mother's womb. He is prevented by Michael, and the Almighty is forced to set up a divine court for the 2 to argue their cases. The Torah itself would be offered to Esau before Jacob, and even Ishmael. But the 2 respective guardian angels of the 2, Samael and Rahav, fearing the constricting rules within, declined, as shown in the Shenolikut Bahabaret. he called on Samael, the guardian angel of Esau, and said to him, "Do you want my Torah?" Samael countered, "What is written in the Torah?" God said that it says in the Torah, "Do not murder." God deliberately selected a commandment which he knew Esau would have difficulty with. Samael was aghast at the suggestion that his protege should surrender the basic right of his "by your sword you shall live," which had been Isaac's blessing to Esau. He told God to keep his Torah. Samael would go on to point out that Esau surrendered his birthright to Jacob. This in reference to Genesis 25:29-34, where Esau gave it up for a pot of stew. But also he hoped that Jacob and his people would struggle under the constricting rules. More importantly, for we who seek to gain an understanding of Samael, we get an understanding of the philosophy he lives by. By your sword you shall live. A fitting view from one born of the sphere of severity, Gevura. Samael lives under the principle of might makes right, where the strong survive and the weak perish. He would go on to even use the Torah he rejected to try and denounce Jacob, stating he married 2 sisters whilst they were both living. Despite the argument that Jacob married them beyond the lands of Israel, Jacob would be punished via the terrible fate of Dinah and Reuben's impropriety with Bilhah. Eventually, Samael would lose patience with trying to find proof against Jacob from above, and would descend and take human form to attack Jacob directly. Various texts describe this struggle between the two. Samael, like Lilith, is of the night, and as the dawn broke his strength waned. Although taking an injury to his thigh, Jacob would overcome Samael and would let him go only if the angel met his condition. And he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me. Unless you bless me, but it should have been, unless you will bless me. Why, therefore, is it written, literally, unless you have blessed me?" He told him, "If you acknowledge the blessing my father gave to me, and not denounce me for them. It is also written, and he said, your name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel." Why did he call him Israel? He told him, "We are compelled to serve you, for through your exceeding might you have been crowned above in the highest grade. Therefore your name shall surely be Israel." So it was Samael who bestowed Jacob's new title unto him. Living under the principle of might makes right, Samael had no choice but to acquiesce to Jacob and recognise him as the favoured one. But of course Samael would not cease in his efforts against humanity, following his defeat by Jacob. Texts would go on to describe how Moses would become challenged by Samael, who favoured the Egyptians. Often seen as a land of sorcerers and fraud to Lilith and her ilk in Jewish texts, it should be no surprise that Egypt was seen as a land under the dominion of Samael. When the Pharaoh gave chase after Moses and his people, texts state Samael lent him his own chariots, with Ginsberg's Legend of the Jews stating Samael provided 600 chariots manned with his own hosts at his disposal. When the fleeing people came before the Red Sea and Samael saw the miracle that was about to occur, he objected to God. We have to refer to the Shemot Rabbah 21:7, where Samael is described as opposing the impending miracle, claiming that until very recently the Israelites had worshipped idols with the same fervour as the Egyptians. In other words, the Israelites were subject to the attribute of justice. Of course, as we know, God would not accept this, and the parting of the Red Sea would occur. But this would not be the last time Moses would have to contend with Samael. A lesser known but rather touching tale of Moses is when he understands his time of death approaches. Fearing this, he pleads to God frequently to be spared from death. God attempts to console him, but after Moses presses to be spared, God ceases to answer. Moses seeks intercession from various peoples, angels and elements, but Samael prevents their prayers reaching out. As we shall discuss later, Samael is none other than the Grim Reaper of legend. He is tasked with collecting the souls of those whose time has come to an end. Unsurprisingly, when he is sent to collect the soul of Moses, he gleefully heads out to do so. But it does not go as he expected. Samael now went forth from God in great glee, took his sword, girded himself with cruelty, wrapped himself in wrath, and in a great rage betook himself to Moses. When Samael perceived Moses, he was occupied in writing the ineffable name. A dart of fire shot from his mouth, the radiance of his face and of his eyes shone like the sun, so that he seemed like an angel of the hosts of the Lord. And Samael, in fear and trembling, thought, it was true when the other angels declared that they could not seize Moses' soul. Samael is sent fleeing. only to be chastised by God and, despite begging to be spared the duty, Samael eventually resolves to collect Moses' soul or die in the intent. He very nearly does so, save for God's intervention. At last, God himself attends to Moses' departure, and Samael, unaware of this, but not daring to return without the soul, searches around in confusion for the now disappeared Moses. There are other activities in the Bible attributed to Samael's meddling, such as the evidence of Tamar's pregnancy, as well as many other legends, such as Rabbi Rena's ill-fated attempt to bind Samael and Lilith. But this video is long enough already, and I wish to provide some context as to Samael's position within the Qliphot and Sephirot. Samael is at one and the same time an angel, something holy, and also the source of death, evil. Samael is a being who, in some accounts, still holds place within the higher spheres, whilst at the same time ruling over the entities of the Qlipha. As mentioned earlier, some accounts, much like the legends proclaiming Satan was once the angel Lucifer, claim he was banished from the heavens, replaced by Michael, and now holds a permanent position as ruler over the Qlipha. Either way, I would touch upon his position in the heavens before then exploring his relationship with the shells. There is a legend where Metatron, a fascinating figure in his own right, takes Moses on a tour of the heavens. When they reach the final seventh heaven, Moses encounters the angels of wrath and fury who carry out God's will, which sounds incredibly similar to those entities of the Sephira Gevura. It is here he also encounters Samael. There was another angel in the seventh heaven, different in appearance from all the others, and of frightful mien. His height was so great it would have taken 500 years to cover a distance equal to it, and from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet he was studded with glaring eyes, at the sight of which the beholder fell prostrate in awe. "This one," said Metatron, addressing Moses, "is Samael, who takes the soul away from man." "Whither goes he now?" asked Moses, and Metatron replied, "To fetch the soul of Job the pious." Thereupon Moses prayed to God in these words, "O may it be thy will, my God and the God of my fathers, not to let me fall into the hands of this angel." There are accounts of him ruling over the fifth heaven, although he resides in the seventh. This is not uncommon. It is said Lilith rules over Gamaliel, but resides in Satariel, the shadow of Gevura. Even as an angel, Samael stood out from the others, standing larger than his compatriots. There are various accounts, such as in the Perkti Rabbi Eliza, that where the Chafroth, a type of angel, had 4 wings and the Seraphim had 6 wings, Samael had 12. He commanded the destroying angels, perhaps one of the most famous being that unleashed upon Egypt to take the eldest sons, when Moses demanded his people be freed. This gives the impression of a once grandiose and proud figure who ruled as God's principal figure of justice and will. As such, it is unsurprising that his pride would cause him to rebel when talk of a more perfect creation in the form of man had arrived. Another allusion to the Lucifer mythology of the pride before the fall, save that it is out of jealousy of man rather than seeking to be like the One Most High. The account from Ginsberg also touches upon another of Samael's roles. He is indeed none other than the Grim Reaper, as mentioned earlier. He is tasked with being sent to obtain the souls of those whose hour has come, with only the very few escaping his clutches, such as Enoch, who became Metatron, or Moses, who is attended by God himself. No lover of mankind, he performs this duty with relish. But there are other methods that have been employed to placate him. And such is the trait. As soon as this one confesses in his prayer, they explained in the Zohar in the Pashat Pekudai that this is the portion of Samael similar to the goat. What is his portion that the Holy One, blessed be he, decreed for him? Afflictions. And so Samael immediately arrives there and goes and collects his debt. And behold, this is the goat carrying the iniquities that the Holy One, blessed be he, gives him authority to collect his debt. And Israel is thus purified. But behold, it all devolves upon Samael. And the reason is because the Holy One, blessed be he, decreed upon his world that anyone who does this will be nullified. And this is the reason of, "And you shall kill the beast, Leviticus 20:15. When one truly confesses their sins, it is Samael who takes away the impurity and casts it into the ocean for his subjects to feed upon, the ocean depths often being considered the dwelling place of demons. This is also seen with regard to accounts of sacrificing goats during Yom Kippur, one being led well away from the city to be sacrificed to Samael, or Azazel depending on the account, both sometimes being the same or separate entities, a subject for another video. The means of this is twofold: to place Samael so that even as prosecutor he will give them a favourable account to God on the Day of Atonement. The Israelites were given an opportunity to satisfy the aspirations of Samael by offering him a bribe. Whereas the offering presented to God was a burnt offering, the one offered to Samael, Azazel, was the sin offering, which was burdened with all the sins of the people of Israel. This gift to Samael was designed to deflect his intention to thwart the value of Israel's offering on that day. By playing up to the ego of Samael, God hoped to neutralise him through flattery, so that the purpose of the Day of Atonement could be achieved without interference from that source. When, as a result of receiving the bribe, Samael realised that on that day the Israelites were like angels, not eating, not drinking, etc., he too joined the chorus of Israel's admirers, telling God that Israel were as free from sin as are the ministering angels. Once God hears the testimony of our perennial accuser, he grants atonement to the people, to the priests, and the entire congregation. However, it should not merely be seen as the Jews attempting to bribe Samael for a favourable accounting. Remember that despite his infernal nature, Samael is seen as being of angelic origin and plays a part in creation. As such, even he is to be allotted some portion of sacrifice in recognition of this. In consideration of this, we present Samael with a male goat, acknowledging the fact that he is king in a certain domain and has not wasted his strength on self-gratification of a sexual nature. We treat Samael as if he were still a son, eating at his father, God's table. We present 2 he-goats on the Day of Atonement. Samael does not realise that this very gift serves to remove him from the sanctuary, the holy regions. If I may return once more to Moses encountering Samael in the 7th heaven, this same account mentions that the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of God, also resides there. There are various texts, such as within Pattai's Hebrew goddess, that Samael seeks to gavor with the Shekinah, and that the more the world sins, the more easily he is able to defile her, despite the Shekinah wishing to stay true to the Lord as his consort. This echoes to me the legend of Samael as demiurge, who, in longing for his celestial mother, creates Lilith as per Tyson's text. Whoever brought her to being, perhaps Lilith was indeed made in the Shekinah's image, as Adam was made in God's, as the masculine version, but became a far cry from the real thing. This is but a fraction of why I believe Lilith and Babylon to be very similar but different entities, which I hope to explore separately. But with this comment, let us explore Samael's relationship with the Clipper. We've already seen that the feminine aspect of the Clipper is a far more powerful and exhausting force to combat, compared to the masculine, another means of demonising the feminine, no doubt. But perhaps this is better explained by Samael working in both celestial and infernal roles. Whilst there are accounts of Samael still performing his heavenly duties, Lilith is fully focused upon her role in the Clipper. As such, her power and influence has become much greater there as a result. Returning to the Treaty of the Left Emanation by the Cohen brothers, we once again see that Samael and Lilith are indeed the overlords of the Sitra Ara. Asmodeus and the younger Lilith, who I believe to be Namar, as explained in another video, are king and queen but are subservient to Samael and Lilith. However, everyone quick to jealousy, Samael envies Asmodeus, for he lusts for his wife, the younger Lilith. This conjures the image of something akin to bickering couples in a hellish soap opera. Even though Asmodeus is called the Great King, he is subservient to Samael. He is called the Great Prince with reference to the emanations above him, and the King of Kings with reference to the emanations underneath him. Asmodeus is governed by him and is subservient to him. Samael, the Great Prince and Great King over all the demons, cohabits with the Great Matron Lilith. Asmodeus, the King of Demons, cohabits with the lesser, younger Lilith. The scholars of this tradition omit many horrendous details concerning the forms of Samael and Asmodeus, and the images of Lilith the bride of Samael and Lilith the bride of Asmodeus. Happy is he who merits this knowledge. As we know, this structure would go to take on the form of Samael ruling via his 4 queens, with Lilith being the most prominent amongst them, each being allotted their own kingdom to rule and preside over. However, I would like to offer a supposition with regards to Samael's relationship with the 4 queens, for I think it may entail more than simply they being answerable to him and acting as his powerful concubines. What many people are not aware of is that many legends agree, commonly those spirits described in Jewish and Arabic mythology, that the spirits we commonly know as demons eat, drink, live and die just as we do. They are not immortal and are subject to lifespans just as we are. If this is true, then chances are famous figures in mythology such as Meridiana or Abraham will have already long since passed away. Yet we are told this is not the case for the 4 queens, that they are exempt from mortality. Rabbi Abba said, "Since we know that demons die like humans, how can she still be alive?" He answered, "Right, but Lilith and Naamah and Agraf, the daughter of Mahalath, who came from their side, all continue to live until the Holy One, blessed be He, eradicates the spirit of uncleanness from the world." But how is this the case? How might they endure when their children do not? For this listener, I have a theory that I would ask you to indulge me with. It is stated that for the husks to survive, they still require sustenance from the Godhead, the emanations. In Tishbe's work, it is revealed that, much like the droughts and floods of this world, the clipper receives trickles of this emanation up to 3 times a year. There are 9 rivers, and he lies among them. And there is one river whose waters are peaceful, and into which the water pools of the garden fall 3 times a year. And when they fall twice, the river is blessed, but not to a large extent. And when they fall once, it is blessed even less. This monster enters the rivers. It gathers strength, swimming as it goes, entering the sea, and swallowing fish of many kinds. And it rules and returns to the river. These trickles cause the monster, identified in Tishbe's footnotes as Samael, to come forth from his abode. Perhaps this is an allusion to him descending from his place in the heavens to attend to his duties in the clipper. Or it's him emerging from his palace within the clipper to tend to his subjects, but also his queens, bringing with him a flow of the emanation to grant them sustenance, since he is of the same angelic nature and made of that same fiery element. Being his wives who copulate with him directly, perhaps they are granted a greater portion of this emanation, and in so doing quicken themselves and extend their lifespans. Sometimes it occurs less than 3 times, as a result of which the clipper wanes. Truly, it conjures quite the image in my mind, for if this is the case, it must be done in quite the celebratory manner, just as the agents did here with events such as Sawi or Beltane, an enticing glimpse into the culture and life of the denizens of the clipper. Perhaps to support this theory is the passage from the Citri Torah at the beginning of this video, stating, "The spirit of the male is subtle, the spirit of the female is diffused in many ways and paths." Tishbe, in his Wisdom of the Zohar, interprets this as Samael is the soul and Lilith the body, with Lilith performing deeds through the power granted to her by Samael. 4 degrees, 4 husks, worlds of Samael block the light of the Sephiroth, and defray them with the deeds of the lower ones. They come, God forbid, and do evil in the world of Norga, a great cloud and fire that bursts, and wind of tempest, since this is explained through Ezekiel's Vera. As mentioned before, the earlier accounts of the clipper does not show them as a dark reflection of the tree of life, but 4 husks, one over the other, which Samael presides over. But what of the more modern text concerning this? I cannot deny the majority of modern texts are incredibly misguided and seem to conjure their structures out of nowhere. Nonetheless, to me the legend of Lilith and Samael is a story that is still evolving to this day, and to ignore modern interpretations is to ignore the continuation of their legend. And as such, I would look next to that of the Dragon Rouge's take on Samael, specifically Thomas Carlson in his excellent Kabbalah, Cliffhoff and Goetic Magic. Here we are presented with the clipper as the shadow tree rather than the 4 husks, the dark reflection of each of the Sephira. Each clipper is ruled over by a demon, though confusingly these clippers are named after a demon, whilst not being ruled over the same demon. The clipper named Samael being a prime example of this. The Sephira, Hod, is the bright intellectual aspect of consciousness, and through it we create form to better understand the nature of our comprehension. The clipper, Samael, is the shadow form of this. It is the achievement of intellect through madness, the breaking of established order for greater comprehension. Picture the mad scientist archetype from games and movies, and you're not far off from the basics of this sphere. Carlson explains this sphere thusly. Hod is the bright side of Samael. Hod represents the intellect and belongs to the higher astral level. Samael is the dark intellect that can be perceived as madness, the originality and genius that is active outside the frames of reason and conventions of civilization. Carlson identifies Edgar Allan Poe as amongst those influenced and gave an excellent quote from said writer that I think gives an excellent account of this plane. Men have called me mad, but the question is not yet settled, whether madness is or is not the loftiest intelligence, whether much that is glorious, whether all that is profound, does not spring from disease of thought, from moods of mind exalted at the expense of the general intellect. So how is the clipper Samael related to Samael the being? Carlson identifies the poison that the poison of God uses as the key to accessing higher intelligence, thus bringing this form of wisdom under Samael's domain. But also, the ruler of this sphere is identified as Adramelech, a god mentioned in the Bible whom the Assyrian Sepharvites sacrificed children to. Some scholars believe the etymology of this name, Adir Melech, means splendid king. As such, it should be no surprise that some modern practitioners identify Adramelech as being the same entity as the Yazidi deity Melek Taus, the peacock god. In Yazidi religion, Melek Taus is a chief angel in the heavens, one of the emanations of God. He was ordered to bow before no one other than the Almighty. However, when Adam was created, the Almighty ordered them all to kneel before his newest creation. All the archangels did as commanded, save one, Melek Taus. Is this story beginning to sound familiar, listener? Samael was an angel that refused to bow to the superiority of humanity out of jealousy. But here we are presented with a more positive tale. Melek Taus did not bow because he considered God and him alone his master, and as a consequence he did not fall, but was actually rewarded with authority and as an intermediary force on earth. So naturally it is unsurprising that some consider Melek Taus as synonymous with Samael. As I hope you are beginning to see, listener, just as Lilith cannot be neatly classified as good or evil, neither can Samael, perhaps even more so, for he is a being belonging to two worlds and neither, an angel who has likely been expelled from the heavens, a king of demons whilst not being truly one himself. The problem I've often seen when it comes to angels is how loyal and strict they are, mimicking the religious fervour of the inquisitors of the medieval era. Whilst in contrast, Samael has remained true to his own desires, his need to satisfy his own ego, his own lusts. To me it is rather ironic, for in some respect he portrays many of the characteristics found in the humans that he works so hard to undermine, which are often missing in the angels still found in paradise. In this light, one could argue that Samael is more human than he would care to admit. Thank you for listening. I hope this provided a more in-depth light on Samael than many other works that they provide. Whilst it cannot be denied that the secret aura is predominantly feminine in its current, with Lilith holding the greatest influence, one would ignore the masculine aspect of this realm at their peril. For whilst different, it comes with its own power and lessons, as well as providing a balance between the two aspects of the current. With that, I shall end the video here. Naturally, there is an enormous amount of literature and topics regarding Samael that I could continue with, but I do not want this video to go on too long. Instead, if you feel you have an affinity with Samael, then perform your own research, or better still, seek to communicate with him yourself through various meditations. As I have forewarned before, however, listener, these are not beings that can be summoned on a whim. If you are not committed, then Samael will consider you not of them, and as such will have no misgivings about bringing harsh judgment upon you, just as he has done to humanity for centuries. But if you are fortunate enough to gain his favour, then you shall gain a glimpse into something incredible, and with it an understanding and intellect that shall be both wondrous and torturous in its blessing. As for the next video, I am considering continuing on the masculine side of the secret aura with an in-depth look at Asmodai, or Asmodeus as he is now better known. Or perhaps I will return upon the succubi Aprahel, or I have been looking into the Queen of Sheba more and more of late. As always, feel free to let me know your preference, listener. I do read all the comments and am grateful for all the wondrous support I have received. But anyway, I'm going on for a bit too long now, so I'll stop here. So until next time, listener, may Lilith grant you pleasant dreams.